we're getting a bit forward, though you raise issues that are obviously important. And I think it is fair to say at that time, the American view was that the military timetable, with a little bit of give, had to be adhered to. My point is simply this is the question, is from the end of January, you had perhaps 6 weeks, maybe more, maybe 7. How did you think you could get a resolution through in such a short period of time? And wasn't the danger of this situation that, in a sense, not only were you giving Saddam an ultimatum, but you were almost giving yourself an ultimatum as well?
Well, it wasn't that I was giving myself an ultimatum, because our position had been clear. We had to resolve this through the UN. If we couldn't resolve it through the UN inspectors, we had to resolve it by removing Saddam. What actually happened was we had time enough to do it. The problem was very simple. In the end, after 1441, in a sense, France and Germany and Russia moved to a different position, and they formed their own pole that was a power, in a sense, that was essentially saying to America, we're not going to be with you on this.
Well, again, we'll come to that in a moment. Just on the military timetable, I mean, again, we've heard from a number of witnesses the American concern that it was unrealistic to keep the troops, once mobilized and deployed, out in Kuwait, in the Gulf, weather getting hotter, for a prolonged period of time. So the military planning was, one way or another, bearing down hard on the diplomatic process.
Yes, that is correct. And in this sense, I think it's fair to say that the only reason why Saddam was having anything much to do with the inspectors at all, and they were getting dribs and drabs of more cooperation, was because he had 250,000 troops down there with all their machinery sitting on his doorstep. So you're always in a position where you've got to be very careful then. I think many of the witnesses have said this to your inquiry, not just the Americans. I think our own military were concerned if you then had months with the troops down there, as inspections went on, but nothing really was being resolved. I think that would have been difficult to have done. So in that sense, you're right. Of course, it's always, you've got to, you come to a point of decision. The only thing I would say to you is, and I think this is absolutely vital in understanding, again, the mindset at the time, had Saddam after 1441, in a sense, done a Colonel Gaddafi, if he'd come forward and said, right, I accept it, we're going to full and unconditional appliance, here's the declaration, it covers everything we have, come in, interview our scientists, take them out of the country and interview them if you wish, we are going completely to reposition ourselves. Had he done that, we would have been in a different situation. He didn't.
I mean, he would have had a difficulty in that, though, isn't he? Doesn't he? Because if he had done that, he would have said, we have no weapons of mass destruction, because that, in fact, turns out to have been the case. But he wouldn't have been believed. Indeed, when the head of IEA said at the end, there's no evidence of a nuclear program, Vice President Cheney said, you're wrong. There is still a problem here that, given the hypothesis and the mindset as you describe, it would have actually been quite difficult, given all his background, for Saddam Hussein to have been convincing on this score.
I totally understand the point you're making. Let me explain to you why, Sir Lawrence, I don't believe it's correct in the end. If you look at the Iraq Survey Group report now, and this report, I mean, we'll get to the detail of it a bit later, but this report is very, very important indeed, because what it is effectively is what Blix could have produced had Saddam cooperated with them. And what that report shows is actually the extent to which Saddam retained his nuclear and indeed chemical warfare intent and intellectual know-how. Now, what Saddam could have done perfectly easily is have provided the proper documentation, and he could have cooperated fully in the interviews of the scientists.
But if you look at the report, one of the problems that the Iraqis had got themselves into is when they had dismantled a lot of this stuff, they had not maintained proper documentation. So you're almost in an audit trail problem here. Indeed, Jack Straw almost raised this when he was talking about why he thought there was stuff there. It goes back to the 1998 documents. Is actually, it would have been quite hard in the circumstances and beliefs of the time for a convincing case to be made. I mean, I don't want to belabor this point, but
it's a very important point, if you don't mind me saying so.
I'm happy for you to respond.
Because actually, if you look both at the Blix reports, and we can come to the detail of that, and the Iraq Survey Group, he was deliberately concealing documentation. And what is more, he was deliberately not allowing people to be interviewed properly. Indeed, in December 2002, this is after Resolution 1441, we received information, and this information remains valid, that Saddam called together his key people and said that anybody who agreed to an interview outside of Iraq was to be treated as a spy. Now, the reason for that is very simple, and it emerges from the Iraq Survey Group report. He retained full intent to restart his program, and therefore it was very important for him that the interviews did not take place, because the interviews with senior regime members were precisely what it would have indicated, the concealment and the intent.
Indeed, and this indicates perhaps a problem going back to the dossier and the specificity there. If it had been said that there was a continued intent of Saddam Hussein to have a weapons of mass destruction program, then that might have, that would undoubtedly have had a degree of credibility. But the problem was that the specificity was that it was there, it had been reconstituted, and the weapons were there.
Yes, but this is, as I say, and I think Sir Lawrence, you're absolutely right, but this is absolutely at the crux of it.
Indeed, I mean, it's a problem, and I do want to get on to Dr. Blix now, because it is a problem, and we discussed this a lot with Lord Goldsmith as well, is that it's true that the issue of material breach was around the question of non-cooperation with the inspectors rather than hiding particular weapons.
Well, sorry, it's really very important to get this right. It is absolutely clear from the Iraq Survey Group, and indeed the Butler report deals with this, that he was concealing material he should have delivered up to the UN, that he retained the intent not merely in theory, but was taking action on, for example, dual-use facilities that were specifically in breach of the United Nations resolutions.
I'm not actually disagreeing that there were significant elements of military material breach in Saddam's behaviour. This is really as much about the diplomacy and what's going on in New York as it is about what's going on in Iraq. To get a second resolution, which is where our discussion started, you needed the evidence that Saddam had not taken up the final opportunity. You needed the evidence of the material breach. Now, where was this going to come from? Who was going to provide the statement?
Well, Blix and his reports were obviously the key documents here. And you'll see from his reports, he goes through them, I think, on the 19th of December, then he's got one on the 9th of January, I think, then again on the 27th of January, then...
So it's important that he's providing his reports.
Correct.
Was the strategy, as you discussed it around the time of the White House meeting at the end of January, dependent upon Blix being rather firm in his assertions of material breach, as he had appeared to be in terms of at least talking about non-cooperation? He didn't declare material breach, but in his discussions of non-cooperation in his January the 27th report. So were you sort of hoping, expecting that he would reinforce your view by continuing to take that position?
Well, the whole point was that his view was that Iraq was complying somewhat, but not fully and unconditionally. And as time went on, I became increasingly alarmed, actually, that we were just back into a game-playing situation with Saddam. I think we were, incidentally. I think it's very clear from what we know now that he never had any intention of his people cooperating fully with the inspectors.